So warm welcome from me. I'm Jo Robinson. I work for Metro Charity, which is an equality and diversity charity. And yeah, we're really pleased to be bringing you this event live on HIV, activism, and a sort of run through our history in terms of the community response to HIV and AIDS, particularly looking back at the 1980s. So, yeah, many of you will have seen It's a Sin, Russell T Davis's drama recently. So we'll be taking some reflections on that, and we'll be hearing from people who are living with HIV and were diagnosed with HIV during those years. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion tonight. We're also going to have a little bit of a clip of a video for you. So yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. Okay, so just going to go round the room and get you to introduce yourselves. Be great if you could just say your name, your pronouns if you like, and also maybe just say something by way of introduction, maybe your background in the community or with the subject. So I'm going to ask if Mark Mcnestry would start. Over to you, Mark.
Hi, Jo. Thanks. Just unmuting myself. Yeah, it's great to be here. Great to see the event happening. My name's Mark Mcnestry. I began working in Greenwich as their first targeted HIV/AIDS prevention worker in 1992, and very quickly established a relationship with then Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre. And from that grew work, which it's great to see has continued throughout the years since. So very much appreciate being invited to participate today and talk through some of that history.
Great, thanks, Mark. And then I'm going to ask Mike to introduce himself. You're on mute, Mike.
There we go. Sorry about that. So my name's Mike Hartley, and I was employed at the Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre as a result of Mark's work between the Health Authority and GLGC. And myself and Mark did needs assessment work originally within Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre, and that led to the formation of a project to undertake broader HIV prevention work, we called it then, but I kind of prefer HIV health promotion work. And sort of we brought some staff in and we started a small project. And then I was at the Metro through till 1997. I was also a bisexual man coming to work at the Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre, and I was part of that change as the centre took on those issues. And then sort of 1997, I moved to New York, and that's why I'm on the lovely daylight and everybody else is not. And since then, I've made websites.
Thanks very much, Mike. So lovely to welcome you from New York. And I'm going to ask Mark Thompson to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks for having me today. So my name is Mark Thompson, pronouns he, him. I'm one of the co-directors of the Love Tank, a community interest company that works with marginalised communities around health inequalities. We are probably most famous for inventing and giving you Prepster. I've worked in and around sexual health and HIV since 1992, have a long relationship with Metro and Greenwich Lesbian and Gay groups and centres, having worked with Mike, I think back in the 90s when I ran Big Up, the country's first organisation fully funded for Black gay men. I'm also a man living with HIV and have been diagnosed since 1986. So really looking forward to a conversation this evening to share some of my experiences and to hear from others.
Great, thanks, Mark. Lovely to have you here. And then just get Sakti to introduce herself.
Hi, Sakti Suripakasam. I'm kind of here because I worked at the Metro for about 10 years, from 93 to 2003. And I guess worked very much with Mark Mcnestry and Mike Hartley around how the HIV prevention work developed at the Metro. And I guess saw it grow from quite a small organization to a medium-sized organization. And previous to that, I had worked at the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre. I now work for Lewisham Council. And I guess I feel very privileged to be part of this conversation, along with some of my colleagues who I'm delighted to see again. I haven't seen some of you for a long time. So yeah, looking forward to this.
Thanks, Sakti. Welcome. And lastly, just get Jose to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jose Mejia, and I'm Metro's HIV peer support manager. And it's quite really exciting to be here and to hear about all the work that, partly because what I do now, it's possible because of all the work that you've done or did with the Lesbian and Gay Center back in the 80s and 90s. So it's really exciting to be here. And yeah, I've been living with HIV myself since, I can remember now, 2008 or 9. 2008. And yeah, and I've been working with Metro since 2016. So yeah.
Thank you, Jose. And I'll just say a little bit more about me. So I'm Jo. I've been working at Metro for about 3 years, and I head up our HIV services. And I think I first got involved in HIV in about 1996. So yeah, I've often worked and been in the community around supporting people with HIV, and worked on lots of different HIV prevention programs and projects. So yeah, we're sort of going to take a trip down memory lane for a lot of us this evening. So yeah, really good to see you all. Of course, I was just thinking, It's a Sin, the programme has been on Channel 4, and I know most of you have been watching it, and lots of the people watching tonight will have seen it. And so I was just thinking it really frames some of our history discussion in terms of showing scenes from the 1980s and early 90s. So I was going to just start with this question. What was your experience of those times? And how did you actually experience that period? And if you weren't, I know at least one of us wasn't even born, I don't think, during that period. So I'm going to also ask the same question, because that period, I have a guess, would have shaped you too. So so the questions, how did you experience that period, the 80s and the 90s? And really it was the first time when the HIV/AIDS crisis, it really was in total crisis. So could you give us a few thoughts, introductory thoughts on that? So I'm going to ask Mark Thompson to kick us off.
Thanks, Jo. It's a big question. I think for me, the most important thing to say is, I was diagnosed in the middle of all of that was going on, and I'd not long come out. So my experience, excuse me, of the epidemic was really lived experience. I was deeply in it because of my own diagnosis. But I think that what's was really interesting about the program, without giving away any spoilers for people who haven't seen it yet, it was a really good reflection of the fear, the stigma, the rejection, the isolation that people who were impacted or infected by the virus experienced at the time. It was a febrile atmosphere. The press was coming for particularly the gay community, but then expanded that lens out to anybody that might be affected or at risk of HIV. So it was highly stigmatizing, really, really frightening. I think for a lot of us in our communities, especially in those early days, we had no idea what was going on. So this mysterious virus comes along, and even when we do start to get a handle on it, we're not really sure how to respond or what we can do. But if I take away one abiding memory from that period of time, in spite of all of that, our communities came together. and came together incredibly strongly to create organisations like what eventually became the Metro, Terrence Higgins Trust, Black Liners, NARS, a whole range of others. It created a groundswell of activism, which we are still feeling the effects of today. And it also changed health and social care. So the way that we engage with health and social care, the way that doctors talk to patients, the way that patients can relate to their doctors was all changed because of the epidemic. So I look back on it with really sad memories, but also memories and the knowledge that we changed the world as a result of it.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's really beautifully put in your last sentence, I think. You know, this sort of sadness and just the sheer enormity of it, as well as something very powerful coming from that period as well. So I'm going to invite Mark Mcnestry next.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. 1983, I remember as a young gay man, still living in the northeast of England, watching TV and seeing Horizons, A Killer in the Village, and knowing that I was about to head off to London. And so, having this real excitement, this real anticipation for getting to the capital, but also thinking, shit, that's not sounding great at all. And so, those early months, those years were filled with excitement, and it was very much about me growing and developing as a young gay man. But very, very much at the heart of that was the HIV experience and that community response to that. Very quickly, kind of embedding myself in LGBT communities, getting involved in HIV/AIDS voluntary work, and then ending up as an HIV professional, working in health promotion. It taught me huge life lessons around activism, our own ability to change, the context within which we found ourselves by working collectively. That we could change the world despite enormous odds. So it's very much a contrast to me. I think that contrast was very much reflected in Descent too, and it was great to see that. And it's actually the depiction of that experience that I've most recognised and most related to. I think I had one or two feelings, and it'd be interesting to maybe touch on those later. But generally, it was great and better than anything that there's been before.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. And then I'm going to invite Sakti.
So I guess just following on from Mark, one of the things that really resonated with me from It's a Sin was the sense of excitement and the discovery of the scene before all of that emerging kind of horror of HIV. And often alongside, the two things working alongside each other, which is what made it really hard, the whole stigmatization of our sexual selves. That was one of the hardest things, I think, to feel, because at the same time you were experiencing the discovery of the scene and other gay people, and it was amazing. But I suppose the other contextual thing was that it was a time of great activism generally, CND, anti-apartheid movement, all kinds of things that were going on at the time, which made it a really active period. That's my memory of it. So, very mixed emotions, exactly like Mark says, really. And it brought it all back watching It's a Sin.
Thank you, Sakti. And then I'm going to invite Mike Hartley.
Hi, thanks, Joe. So my experience, I think, is maybe a little different, and yeah, it feels like an enormous question. What was that time like? So I came out the late 80s, early 90s, and started working in the early 90s. And at that time, I think as a community, we'd learned some things about HIV, and we were actually, there was fear, there was stigma, there was discrimination. But by the time I had sort of started working in the sector, we'd started to receive some investment of monies from the government, and were able to act with agency, and that felt exciting and powerful at the same time. And like Mark said, in a way, we changed the world. We were very brave, I think, and very brazen in many ways. And sort of part of it was partly we were trying to unpick, as Sakti mentioned, a sort of stigmatization. We were partly trying to unpick rules that started at the beginning of HIV and AIDS that were crucial about how to manage risk and health and safety, but which didn't necessarily apply as we got deeper into the epidemic. So use a condom every time. We were trying to sort of work out how to move on from that and have a more nuanced understanding. I feel like use a condom every time is a bit like a lockdown. It was this overarching thing, and we were trying to work out new ways of being, and that was exciting. But one of my major feelings from that time is just extraordinary anger with the government and with authorities for failing gay and bisexual men, failing queer people on every front, really. And the excitement to have a job that we could try and do something about that, and try and make a difference and try and build community. In part, along with doing HIV prevention, that time was also, I was coming into a lesbian and gay centre as a bisexual, and I think Sakti and I and Mark very much held what that meant, and how we dealt with that, and how to kind of evolve. So that's also a part of my experience of that time. But incredibly angry, and moments where I felt powerful and empowered as we did things, and moments where I had to hide in my bedroom all day because it was overwhelming. But probably like Mark, I feel like we changed things, we changed the world, and that, I feel proud of that. I feel proud of my involvement in that. And I haven't watched the show, so I can't compare.
Thank you, Mike. And then I'm going to ask Jose, what did this period of time, what impression did it sort of leave on you?
I mean, it's interesting for me to talk about that period of time because I didn't live through it. So I was born in '86, and then that's when all of this was happening. But it pretty much informs who I am today for different reasons, for the work I do, for my lived experience, for a wide range of reasons. I think it is the other thing that is very interesting for me to see is sort of the way in which me not being or being from Latin America and having lived in Colombia for many years have sort of, there wasn't that much of the health promotion. So I didn't know. So yes, I knew I was gay, and I came out really quickly, or yeah, I was probably 16, 17 when I knew I was gay and came out, but I didn't knew pretty much nothing around HIV or AIDS. So I kind of just saw the fun part of it, and the being gay and the parties and the meeting boys, but then didn't know that there was all these other things happening. So I guess I carry on a lot of things with me about, like, I guess anger, but with myself for not having seen what was happening, for not noticing what was happening, for not digging deeper into what was out there. With having lived in sort of a bubble and not knowing all of that, but then I also, this pretty much, it's all the time in my work, and I work with a lot of people who lived through it and who shared those experiences and that anger and all of that. And I think I've picked up on some of that, and I have some of that anger on me from with the government, and I think seeing the scenes of It's a Sin is just a reminder that this happened to a lot of people, and that these were a lot of lives that well, not all, that went too quickly because of a lack of policies and stuff like that. So I think I carry on a lot of that anger, and that's sort of what's have bring me to doing this work and to be interested in doing more of this work.
Thank you, Jose. Yeah, and it's good to hear somebody with a bit of a later perspective as well. And I know we'll bring that in later. And just listening to you all, I'm just remembering how complex the issues were, weren't they? The anger that you talked about, and also the sort of rage, but also the sadness, and just every emotion going. And I just remember some of the things that the government was doing as well, which must have made it feel so difficult to do what you were trying to do, and just that climate of homophobia, and also ostracizing other communities. So we're going to pick up on more of it and get into some of these threads that you've all raised in a bit. So we're going to go now, and we're going to watch a little video. It's 8 minutes long, and it will really bring to life. Some of you star in the video, which is great, and it just gives people watching a little bit of a sense of the history from that time through video.
When I was in the 80s, when it was being advertised on the television, "Don't die of ignorance," the big tombstone, and it was one of the only things that frightened me at the time.
A friend of mine said, you just go for the test. You can go for this test for HTLV3. And I just thought, why not? I've only been out for a little while, and just go for it. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? It'll come back negative, right?
Yeah, I had to wait a week or longer, I think. 8 days, 7 or 8 days for the results. So I had that long wait just to get the result.
And I'd heard it's the worst 2 weeks of your life. You're just going to worry. It's going to be awful. And I didn't. I was like, yeah, whatever. Got a test, no, went off, because I didn't expect a positive result at all.
My name was called out. I was called into the room, and he said, "I'm afraid to tell you that you're HIV, and then you're positive." And then he just kept talking, but I didn't really focus much. You kind of go into a daze, like you've been hit.
So I got the news. It was shock. I remember being just absolutely thrown, and just feeling like I was in a tunnel, just like tunnel vision, and I couldn't hear anything. Just this like sound of waves. Yeah.
I remember visiting a friend of mine who was poorly, and they put him in he had his own room, and that wasn't for positive reasons. Obviously, that was, you don't want anyone near you. So he had his own room, and I remember the door opening, and someone pushing a tray of food on the floor through and closed the door. And he explained that that's how they delivered his food. And he passed not long after that.
Nobody knew what was going on. And so, you were getting headlines like the gay plague. The community was in absolute panic and meltdown because we didn't know what was going on. This is before mass death, where we're still trying to get our head around it in this country.
Coming on in that same time as Clause 28, it just felt like Like nobody cared about us. Not really.
So we both kind of had a knowledge that HIV was a big issue, and we felt like health promotion, we knew, was doing some outreach work, and we felt like immediately there was an opportunity there. Why weren't we connected with them a bit more? That's, I think, how we got in touch with Mark Mcnestry.
When Sackett and Donna came in, it was just brilliant because, you know, they brought kind of so much new energy and enthusiasm.
He was part of health promotion and doing HIV prevention, sexual health outreach with gay and bisexual men. And we met with him, and I think immediately we started talking about the opportunities to work together.
What happened in Greenwich was slightly in contrast to maybe what was happening in the centre of town, you know, with gay men fighting AIDS. I think what we had was this real opportunity in this centre.
So Mike came in, and the idea was that they would develop the project and the thinking and the places to target and where Metro-based services would happen, or the Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre-based services would happen.
So we took a very reflexive, responsive approach to try and understand the needs of men in the community. And that was both in terms of sex and behavioural change, but also how they socialised, what their networks were, where they had access to services.
We were doing outreach to public sex environments. Michael had a little yellow Mini, and I had a little blue Renault 5. And I think between them, you know, we were lucky if we had like one of them working on any particular day. So we'd get in one of the cars and with loads of condoms and leaflets, and you know, hang about in bushes on Blackheath and outside toilets in Charlton and in Greenwich.
And then we basically just really, in a quite flirty way, talk to as many people as we could, ask them about safer sex, ask them if they needed condoms, ask them if they knew about safer sex.
You know, we were developing a way of working on the job, you know, just kind of testing things out.
When we had the results of that year's worth of work, we were able then to apply for a full-scale project, HIV prevention project, based at the Lesbian and Gay Centre. What do we want to name an HIV prevention project that's really going to attract men, and it's quite sexy, but still gives the sense of what the project is about?
So we wanted to identify clearly that we were about sex and penetration, and Thrust came out of that.
I remember laughing my head off when they said, oh, we're going to call it Metro Thrust.
So for me, kind of Metro Thrust was maybe kind of a bit too assertively masculine. But, you know, but it was also very much in line with the messages around kind of what worked at the time, you know, around being sex positive, and it did reflect the energy, you know, the drive.
What the HIV prevention project showed is that we needed to go out there and talk to men as well. So it did increase the traffic, definitely. But what we didn't want to ignore was the trickle of need that was around mental health.
That surprised me that clip just ended like that. So I didn't realise it. So it stars kind of all of you, doesn't it? So I think one of the next questions I was thinking to ask is, so what was it actually like? You know, we were sort of covering the period a bit there, weren't we? Sort of early to mid 90s, and I was thinking it was before we were able to have combination therapy. So before we were really able to have effective treatment for HIV, which we have these days. So what, maybe a few of you could just say a little bit about, what were the needs of the men that you worked with, and just give us a little flavour of some of the work that you did, and sort of flavour of that time. So maybe I'll just ask Mark Mcnestry to start us off.
I think one of the most shocking things, really, especially, and It's a Sin has brought this to the surface for me, or reminded me, and it also connects with that anger that people were talking about, which I very, very much felt. And that is that we're talking about 1992, 1993, and the pandemic had been going for 10 years and more by then. And it's really, when I started working there at Greenwich Health Promotion, I was appointed as somebody to work with hard to reach groups. And although I now say, I was the first person employed to work with gay and bisexual men, I carved that out of the role, and I was spending half of my time working with sex workers, and half of my time with men who had sex with men. But as a lone worker, but there was this huge opportunity, this massive opportunity, which was Greenwich Lesbian and Gay Centre. Something which very, very few other places had, and it was also an area where you didn't have the kind of exciting scene that you had in the West End, one or two pubs and what have you. So I think it's the centre was a huge resource, but it was struggling. It had one worker, and that one worker seemed very, very reluctant to engage with the work, and that brought up issues for me about why after all this time are we beginning these conversations now? And as I said in the piece, it was just fantastic that they managed to fill the model there at GLGC was at that time was a men's worker and a women's worker, and I think there were funding problems and what have you, and the women's post remained empty for a while. And so when Sackley and Donna came in as a job share, it was just fantastic. Suddenly there were enthusiastic people to engage with, and that we could run with it, and that I had support in terms of trying to shift things around resourcing in the borough, because so little or no resources had been going towards gay and bisexual men's work. The context was that the AIDS had been de-gayed in the previous years. I think in terms of people trying to kind of ignore that or avoid that stigma, but that meant there was the danger of queer community organisations not fully taking on the needs and the issues. And I was very, very much informed by the re-gaying argument, which was happening at that time, and so fighting internally within the health authority to shift resource as well, connecting with the community as a gay man myself, to put pressure too, and thank goodness we were able to do that. I mean, it didn't happen immediately. As you heard, we had to do action research. Mike was employed, which was just completely stepped the work up to another gear entirely, and we did this action research and had to prove to the health authority about the need for this work. I mean, the needs were massive. I mean, we had guys living with HIV, guys with their partners who were dying or who had died, who had very little support within the area. I remember kind of having interviews with people and stuff, and going to visit people, and just this real sense of kind of isolation that people were experiencing, and we the contract stretched out into Bexley, and between Greenwich and Bexley, we had the networks weren't there, or you know, they were just beginning to grow, and people were kind of really obviously disconnected, and had really, you know, a huge kind of a whole range of issues. And that was also, I think, what was really, really important, was that and it really informed the approach, was that we never believed it was just about sex, and we never believed it was just about pushing safer sex. I think Mike touched on this earlier, you know, that it was about recognizing people as whole living beings, you know, with a whole range of needs and issues. And so the work was framed around that. In terms of the point I was making around maybe Metro Thrust sounding too masculine, that was about very much acknowledging the fact that we had this really under-resourced lesbian and gay centre, queer centre, that was transitioning to become more inclusive. And Sakti and Mike being very, very much at the heart of that. And but you know, it's women's work was really, really under-resourced, and suddenly we're bringing in all of these resources to men's work, and there was a real danger there that was going to tip the balance. And in historical terms, I mean, you know, Sakti might want to touch on that. I don't know. But you know, we wanted to maintain this. It was about community development, community building, recognizing that the whole community, the whole range of queer people had a whole range of needs, and we were responding to particularly urgent needs that particularly men had at that time.
Thanks, Mark. So let's just ask Sakti to come in. Do you want to say a few things?
I unmuted myself because I wanted to come in. And as Mark was speaking, it just reminded me about something I said in the film initially, I think, which it's making me remember now, because in my current role as someone who manages a team of community development staff, one of the things we're thinking about is the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities who are socioeconomically deprived or who are from BME communities. And it's just really interesting for me that the Metro never, ever felt to me like the kind of place that was always talked about in terms of central London. The people who came through our doors were not glamorous, you know, queer people who were spending loads of money. They were from Woolwich. They were from parts of the borough that were quite deprived. And for me, there was something about our approach that needed to understand where we were. You know, the people that we were seeing had a whole variety of needs, including mental health, and often mental health as well as needs around HIV, as well as all kinds of other needs. So for me, there had to be something more complex and thought out about our response to the way we embraced people, to the way we looked after people, the way we looked after ourselves, really. I always felt like our centre, that was the Metro, wasn't about what people saw as this lovely queer world that was about singing and dancing and being out there having fun. It was much more about what was really going on for people in the community.
Thanks, Sakti. You know, I was thinking it's slightly hard to believe, isn't it, that because the community was so affected by HIV, and yet there wasn't a sort of norm of just, you know, spending and getting resources for that community, was there? Because you know, like Mark said, it had just gone into, you know, AIDS affects everyone, HIV is everyone's issue, but you know, you're very much honing in on you know, the people you were working with, and they were from quite diverse backgrounds by the sound of it. And I wanted to just bring in Mark Thompson, because you know, I was wondering, Mark, you know, what the sort of you know, what your sense of the sort of needs of particularly the Black queer community and the people that you'd have been around, and you know, what sort of needs did you see back then, and how did you respond?
Well, I mean, I think one of the issues that we had was the HIV affects everybody. So we know that the Don't Die of Ignorance campaign launched by the government in 1987 was a broad sweep to inform all of the country about the epidemic. And whilst it took a sledgehammer to crack a nut, excuse me, and was highly effective in doing that, we're still unpicking the pieces now. And therefore we had to have a great big fight to, as Mark has said, to regain the epidemic. But in the regaining of the epidemic, what we did is we forgot some communities that have already been mentioned. But I think where I come in was I started to get involved in the work in around 1991, 92, around that time where we were seeing that movement and the development of things like gay men fighting AIDS and specific projects for gay men. And I think that what I found was that, or we found, excuse me, was that Black gay men were falling through the cracks. So you had organizations by that time in the early 90s that were set up to work with Black communities, particularly Black Caribbean and Black African communities. Then you had organizations which were set up to work with gay men. And neither of those organizations were explicitly working or understanding the lives and the nuances of men from Black and Asian communities. So I started to do work with colleagues and friends of mine of setting up discussion groups in the community, getting tiny bits of funding to run weekend workshops. There wasn't a lot of investment. But then in 1994, Patrick Scott, who was then a volunteer at Black Liners, a Black gay man, recognized and got quite angry that we were falling through these cracks and sought funding to set up Big Up. And so I was employed as the first project coordinator there in 1995 after running a few safer sex workshops. And we got to work really, really quickly. We set up, we got an office and we started to recruit volunteers. I think I remember and we were successful. Our first volunteer meeting had about 25 Black gay men respond to our call. So we really quickly put in, started to produce resources, do outreach, which was culturally appropriate because people weren't going into the spaces that we were going into. So the parties we went to, the clubs that we went to, because the community was very segregated. And that's the thing that we don't talk about. And I think sadly, flash forward 30 years nearly later, we still have the same experience. And Black men, Black and brown men, men from communities where they're non-white or their first language isn't English are still falling through the cracks. So many things have changed, but they haven't. So yeah, we were putting out culturally appropriate and specific work.
Thanks, Mark. So I wanted to just bring in Mike Hartley, because you started to touch, didn't you, Mike, on the sort of outreach work you were doing and then the sort of response you were getting in the community, and also just one or two threads about, you know, I think you mentioned the use a condom every time. It wasn't nuanced enough, it wasn't subtle enough. So yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit about the work you were doing?
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to pick up that Metro, so that's probably my fault. But we were a feminist, you know, like the research we undertook was from a feminist perspective, and we got, I don't know, a lot of the gay men's organisations in central London seemed to think, didn't quite understand that, or that it was an actual academic theory and approach, a way of doing things rather than a political disposition. And I think we did that because we recognized there's a huge range of needs. There were needs around just meeting other men, for that being safe. You know, there was a gay bar in Greenwich, but there was not really much in Bexley, and we covered the areas. So there was just safety, there was access to condoms, there was support for people around their identities and coming around, and around just their lives generally, as Sakti mentioned, mental health. There were issues around access and discrimination in access to healthcare. People were getting arrested, cottaging, and we tried to speak to the police and change that relationship so that those places were safer. People needed support around their diagnosis, support living with HIV. The needs were extensive, and we really did want to do community development, and work, like Mark said, with the whole person, but with the whole community as well. The resources were coming in for the work with men, but it needed to work within that centre. So the needs were really extensive. And then specifically, you said the outreach work, I think, and sort of the changing or sort of unpacking use a condom every time. We were doing outreach work to cottages and cruising grounds. So that's public toilets where men had sex, parks where men had sex, pubs, clubs if they existed, and all the other networks that we were meeting people in. And we were going out into all those networks and just trying to meet men and have discussions. We were recognizing very different needs. We were working with positive men and negative men, and we had a sense that really safer sex, use a condom every time. There were positive men who were partnered with positive men who were not practicing safer sex. There were negative men partnering negative men not practicing safer sex. There were men thinking about who would be insertive or not, or who would fuck who to sort of manage HIV. And it felt like this rule, which was fabulous at the start when we didn't know anything, was not so fabulous anymore. That it maybe even was starting to feel slightly homophobic. I felt like at the time it was being championed predominantly by the men who didn't fuck at that time. It seemed easier for them to hold that than the greyness of intimacy. And I also felt like there was a sense that if you didn't practice safer sex, that somehow you were crazy, or and we were working with that as well and trying to imagine that no, that's not the case. Wanting to have sex without condoms and that intimacy, that's normal, that's beautiful, that's live. So we were trying to find a new way of talking, I suppose, and we were thinking about adult education and what we'd learned in adult education, and that adults don't follow rules. Here we're being given rules around COVID, left, right and centre. We don't need rules, we need education. We need ways to understand things so we can negotiate within our relationships and evaluate and make choices. And sort of at the time of the project going, I was trying to come to the States, and I was working with Gay Men's Health Crisis in the States, and they were trying to take harm reduction that had been applied to HIV and injecting drug use. There was a gay man who was an ex-Mac addict who was running GMHC's HIV prevention, and he was trying to re-narrate harm reduction in the context of sex and sexual relations. And that was one of the things we were bringing back to the Metro as well. And we were just trying to come back to men and their experience and what they told us, and how that didn't necessarily jive or wasn't the same as use a condom every time, and that many men were having sex without using a condom every time and were not contracting HIV and were safe. As I began to leave the Metro, I was even, at the time, my partner, who's my wife now, we were using a thing called a persona, which was a urine-based hormone detection system to avoid getting pregnant. So and I was trying to say, why don't we have that for gay men? We were beginning to learn that positive gay men with low viral load were not infectious. And that was another thing we had to try and bring into the safer sex discussion. And I was saying, why don't we have a test, like where a man can test his infectivity, and then practice safer sex based on that information. We needed a much deeper understanding. And I think that's come now, although I think it's only recently that we've really acknowledged that low viral load means low infectivity. I think that's only just recently been acknowledged. Is that right? At the sort of top levels. But But we were trying to unpick all of that and pull it together into a new narrative around empowerment and people and education.
Great, thank you, Mike. Yeah, just really nuanced your approach to harm reduction and talking to the men about what they actually were doing and needed, and yeah, just very eloquent hearing you talk about the complexity of that. And you know, one message does not work. You know, it's so much more complex. I wanted to bring in Jose because partly I wanted to say, has it worked? You know, these messages in HIV prevention that we've been able to you know, be a lot more nuanced. But what's your impression from that time, Jose, and the time more recently? Do you feel that HIV prevention has changed a lot and is working now?
I mean, it's hard to say because it depends on where in the world we're thinking about. But I think that the language is there, and the language is much more used and much more like people and gay men and people living with HIV are much more familiar with a lot of the language around sort of harm reduction and prevention mechanisms and stuff. But there's still a lot of other sort of, the conversation continues to be a conversation that is very nuanced and that has a lot of sort of what happened in the past and what is happening now, and the conversation becomes like how to bridge these two sort of, or what seems like two different experiences in many cases. So we work with a lot of gay men who lived through the 80s and the 90s and didn't get the virus there, but got it way in 2000 as an adult, and who shame themselves and feel guilty because of that experience. So that's it's really, the conversation becomes really nuanced and say like, well, yeah, how do you deal with that guilt and that shame that from what happened then and what's happening now, and then this idea that people now, because the conversation has become so much more easy, and because we know that not everything fits everyone and that condoms is not the only way, and then there's a lot of sort of finger pointings to who and why and how do you where, like what's okay and what's not okay. So I think the conversation is still very rich and very, very difficult to navigate, and it still doesn't feel like it's a one conversation that fits everyone, or a one approach that fits everyone. And I think we're still seeing a lot of what Mark was describing around like the sort of people that we're leaving behind, or the people that is falling through the cracks, and we see that a lot. And what Sakti was saying about sort of the bigger sort of complex needs that are not only around the sexual health but all the sort of social aspects of a person's life. So we see a lot of sort of mental health problems, and we still see a lot of poverty, and we still see a lot of substance misuse, or so when all these things come together, the conversation is just a different one, and it's a different one with everyone, and I think that's one thing that we still sort of know how to do at Metro, or try to do at Metro, and it's having those very personal conversations with people, because they're very different for each one of us, I guess.
Thanks, Jose. I was just wanting to bring in Mark Thompson again, because I was just wondering what what's it been like, Mark, sort of watching everything sort of change over the years, and move into a place where we do have treatment, and that the U equals U message, and I mean, what's it been like sort of living with those changes? But also, I remember we were around each other in the sort of early 2000s and doing like workshops about if you were undetectable, then you couldn't pass on HIV. That's what we firmly believed, but nobody was saying it. It's only been recently that the doctors have said it, isn't it? So men were making choices, and we were helping men make choices. So how's that been like for you?
I mean, it's really nice that to have gone from teaching people how to put condoms onto bananas all those years ago to telling men and women that you can take a pill a day and that will prevent you from passing HIV on, or you can take a pill a day and that will stop you from acquiring HIV. So I think that is an incredible journey, and I'm you know, I'm so privileged to have seen that evolution in terms of prevention, and just echoing what both Mike and Mark have said and Jose have said around, you know, and you just said, Joe, that we continuously throughout our work as health promoters have tried to look at lots of different ways to enable people to have the best sex with the least harm, taking responsibility, making informed choices. And so we've never, ever just been the condom police. We've tried to meet people where they are, how they live. And I think that's where we've always been incredibly radical. I think, though, that, and we've touched on it a little bit here when we think about communities being missed out, is that not everybody who is at risk of HIV knows these things. Not everybody knows what U equals U means. Not everybody knows about PrEP, that they can access it, that it's for them, that they're at risk. So whilst we've made huge gains, we still have a lot of work to do to enable people to understand that messaging. And I think it's important because, one, it will obviously, you know, help us to prevent further HIV infections and to reach our goal of ending new HIV transmissions by 2030. It contributes to reducing HIV stigma as well. And we know that reducing HIV stigma not only improves the lives of those living with HIV, but it reduces barriers to people getting tested and treated. So we need to continue to ramp up these messages. They need to be part of everyday conversation, but they also need to be hitting the communities most at risk. So I'm not a great big fan of slapping on the back of a bus, you know, that this is the latest HIV information. We need detailed, nuanced, culturally appropriate, language appropriate messages that reach those communities that really, really need to know them.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and it touched for me listening to just, I wanted to bring in Sakti again, because I was realizing, you know, hearing you talk about working in a community development way and hearing Mike really spell that out as well, and everyone's sort of emphasizing, you know, that really people, they have individual needs, but obviously there was a big sort of feeling at the time, wasn't there, that people didn't care, you know, they didn't care about LGBTQ people. And I hazard a guess, many of us still feel that now, that stigma. And I was wondering, Sakti, what was it like? You know, I was very aware there were a lot of lesbians involved, and bisexual women, and a whole range of people involved in a community development approach. So, you know, why do you think there were so many, particularly lesbians, involved in the HIV kind of response?
Well, I think there were, first of all, I think there were a lot of our networks of women were nurses. Actually, it's important to say that. So they were faced every day. I knew a really good friend who went to New York to work in Mount Sinai. They had to call on nurses from this country because nurses there would not go into HIV wards to work with people who were positive. Now, just think about that, you know. So there were women who were involved in this struggle, who were faced with seeing this every day. So for them, it was real. It was real in a massive way. And there were also lots of our friends who were involved in substance misuse, where they came across people who were HIV positive every day. So, you know, in a professional sense, as well as through our personal networks and knowing gay men intimately who were positive, we were faced as women with the issue. It wasn't out there for us. It was right here. It was our friends. It was people we were seeing, people we were working with. So I think that's why it was important for us.
Thank you. And Mark, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, didn't I, that I felt that there was a flaw to ITISIN, and for me it was that question of the absence of lesbian and queer women within you know, the characters. You know, it's so fitted with my experience in so many ways, but you know, where were the lesbians? You know, where were the queer women who were so much at the heart of that experience? For me, you know, my networks, my friendships were very mixed. You know, I was volunteering at the Landmark in Brixton, HIV/AIDS support centre, and you know, half the volunteers were women. Most of those were lesbians, and I worked at the National AIDS Helpline. You know, substantial number of lesbian, bisexual women in the helpline, so it failed in that regard to me, in that it didn't acknowledge that support, that huge support that we had from women within the LGBT community.
Sorry, just having problems unmuting myself, coming in again. So maybe a bit of a follow-up on that then. So I was wondering, I was chatting to a friend of mine this morning, and she sort of prompted that question. And yeah, I was wondering, you know, HIV is one of those issues where people I think they either get really involved in it, or they just sort of give it a really wide berth. And so, yeah, I was just wondering, in a way, around sort of the women that were involved in the response and the early response. You know, I think there's a question for me about posing, you know, have gay men also been involved in women's health issues, you know, particularly lesbian and bisexual women's health issues? Or do you think within our communities, in a way, it's been, you know, a different story? You know, what's the sort of sense of things between us? Because it sounds very encouraging, Mark and Mike in particular, talking about everybody being in there together. But I was wondering, do you think it feels like that now, or what's your sort of sense of it? Mike, yeah.
I was just going to say, as men, I assume we really haven't done that for women. That's the history, and that would change in the same way we haven't included all those people. No, we kind of fail, I think, as men to do that, and I think it's important to say that. But there's also something about love that I need to inject into the conversation about why were women involved, and it was a loving environment, the community, in my experience. Obviously, it had its problems. All communities have problems. All networks have problems. But there was genuine, I think, love from a common experience of stigma and oppression and of striving to be oneself. And I think that was an important part. That was something I felt. And I do feel like, you know, as men know, we've been poor. And I wish we were better.
Oh, thanks for your honesty, Mike. Yeah. And Sakti, yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you said that, because I didn't want to be the first to respond and point my finger at our gay male colleagues, bisexual men. But, you know, it's important to remember that I think all of the things that happen in society, we are not above that as a queer community, you know. So we can be just as patriarchal, just as sexist, just as racist. All of the things that happens out there happens in here. And the important thing is that we try and pay attention to that. But in answer to your question, I think, yes, it's been a little one-sided.
And Mark, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I want to come in on this a little bit, because I've been doing a lot of press in the past couple of weeks, as you might know, around It's a Sin, and that question, and it's been on social media a lot, and I call it, what about Re? What about so and so, and what about X, and what about Y? And when I started watching It's a Sin, I nearly threw my tea at the telly in the first 10 minutes because I didn't like the representation of Black families and the tropes that were put out in it. Apologies for any spoilers. However, by the end of it, I recognized that this was written by one person, a white gay man, told through a particular lens of a white gay male experience. And I recognized it wasn't my story. And I don't expect Russell T Davies to write a nuanced account of a black queer experience. All writers have a responsibility to be reflective and all the rest of it. But to be a bit more kind and a bit more generous, I hope that I take the points that everybody has made here. I do think, and I, as a black gay man, have looked back over the narrative and have gone to lots of HIV history events, and very often I'm the only man of color. There are reasons why I'm the only man of color, because lots of men of color who lived with HIV are not coming out. There are lots of women who experience the epidemic who do not feel as strongly about, do not feel they are empowered enough to come out as well. I think that what I hope the drama enables us to do is to open the door, like this conversation has, for us to start having those conversations, for those stories to be explored, for us to start recognizing and giving space for queer women, for cis women, for trans communities that lived through it to start telling those stories as well. And also for a younger generation to start asking those questions. Okay, to start going, actually, right, I'm a queer woman. Where were the women in the epidemic, right? So let's start asking those questions. Let's start digging deep. It's a Sin took over 10 years to get to TV. It's the first mainstream drama that this country has had. There haven't even been documentaries about the epidemic. So it's one piece. It's a powerful piece. Let it be the thing that's kicked open the door for the writers and the creatives out there to start telling their stories. Let's spend more time going, wow, that's amazing. Let's create something. So just to wrap up, I love the soundtrack to It's a Sin. The music was amazing, but that wasn't the music I heard in the nightclubs I went to. So I could have complained. What did I do? I created my own playlist with 100 songs of all the music that we heard in black spaces. So now people have a counter narrative and a counter soundtrack. So let's create this. Let's make those stories. So women, if you're listening and you live through the epidemic, trans folk, put pen to paper, speak to commissioners, put your stories out there, because people desperately want to hear them. It's not just on Russell.
Thanks, Mark. Well said.
And I'm really, really sorry, everybody, about this. I thought the conversation was an hour, and I didn't realize it was nearly 2, and I'm going to have to go very shortly because I've still got some other work which I've had to do. So my sincere apologies for having to leave you all, because this has been a great conversation. But I do have some calls I have to make before 8 p.m, I'm afraid.
No problem, Mark. Well, just wanted to say a really big thanks for you joining us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Joe. Bye. How do I leave? How do I leave? How do I get out? I'm stuck.
So escape.
Live studio down there.
So
Yeah,
Mark, Jose, yeah.
No, I was just going to say that the other thing is that with those things that are not represented in the history of the epidemic is also an opportunity to look forward to how can, if we haven't been that supportive to women or to trans people, how can we do from now on, and what can we learn from what we didn't do before? And I think the love and the sense of community development and the sense of community is there for that to happen, and we've seen it with the sort of discussion around trans people and how there is largely a big support from the rest of the LGBT community. So I think, and that's because of those things that you were mentioning, that sense of community, that love that is there in that community development space. So how can we sort of do it from now on and be more supportive of those things? I think in the one thing that I've seen it a lot is and it's not happening here, but it's happening in Latin America, with this idea of like this big wave for legal abortion in different countries in Latin America, and there's a massive like movement of men supporting this big thing that it's mainly a women's issue, and well, not only women but also trans men who might benefit from these legal things. So I think we're learning as we go. I agree that we haven't been the best, but I think it's an opportunity for us to start doing so.
Thanks, Jose. And Mark, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just trying to pick up a little bit more on what Mark was saying, and there was a great comment actually as he was speaking from Sue Lee on Facebook around she preempted what I was going to say actually around the fact that it's a sin with such a limited opportunity in terms of time, and that. And yes, there are still so many more stories that need to be made. I think Russell T Davies originally had it was 8 episodes or more, and he was told to squeeze it into 5. And you just think, well, how crazy of Channel 4 commissioners, not to realise, how much it was needed, and how strong a piece of work it is.
Thank you. And I just wanted to sort of flick forward a bit. I feel a bit like we've got these sort of slightly missing years in the 2000s and the, coming up to the present day. And I was very aware working in HIV in those times, there was a real growing sub-Saharan African epidemic. And of course, across the world, there have been so many millions of people who've lost their lives. And I was thinking in this country, around that time, it was the first time that a lot of gay men had been, starting to also mix with African communities. I remember we ran a conference in 2001, and I remember a guy from Glasgow saying to me, I've never met anybody from an African background before, ever. He was a white guy. And I think there's something about HIV, isn't there, that often... really that it does hit marginalised communities, and that people do have a sense of stigma and marginalisation, often already to do with their identities. So I wonder whether you might care to comment. There's a comment in the chat from Greg saying, in what ways has stigma sort of touched your lives, whether that's been HIV stigma or racism, or could be issues to do with identity or politics, and things like poverty have often intersected, haven't they? So I'm just wondering, this issue about stigma and how it's sort of shaped the discourse and shaped your lives and the work you do. Anybody care to have a pop at that? Quite a complex area, isn't it? So Sakti.
So I love this narrative that we have about ourselves, that our lives have massively improved and stigma has disappeared. Because I think what that kind of ignores is, first of all, that we all have a journey we're on, where different things about our identity comes to the fore, right? So I was a mother. I am a mother, I should say. It's not stopped being one, by the way. And I just think there have been times when that has felt massively more important than my identity as a Black woman, as my identity as a queer woman. So being a mum has been more important than any of those other things. And I'm sure this is a common experience for lots of people. But I just remember that recently, when I was in a local authority setting, not in Lewisham, I would add, Lewisham is lovely, but in another local authority setting, I worked amongst a whole team of people, and I was, as far as I knew, the only queer person in that team. In fact, I did know that. And it was a team of 20 odd people, 25 people. And I would go in every day, and, I'm a bit leery. I'm always asking people about their personal lives. Nobody once in the nearly 3 years I worked there asked me anything about my personal life. Anything. Like, what did you do on your holiday? How's your partner? Who is your partner? You know, how do you guys do? What do you do on Valentine's Day? You know, where do you go on holiday? None of that. And this was just like 5 years ago. And I was struck by this idea that it's almost like we're all equal, but we're just not going to ask you about your life. So I'm just really struck by this narrative that somehow we're all equal, because we're not. There's still the overriding thing that some people's lives have more legitimacy than the rest of us. And it's not out there and horrible. People aren't saying horrible things to you, but there is definitely a sense of who is at the top of the pile, who gets to talk about their lives.
Thanks, actually. Yeah, and I can see Mike wants to come in.
I'm going to mention stigma in my life in a moment, but it's funny, Sakti, you conclude there with, I think that's a particularly British, maybe even English thing. The ability to make people feel bad about themselves is quite uniquely powerful in the UK, and I have enjoyed very much not having that. And I think the class system reinforces stigma. The class system is a system by which we are allowed to ignore the needs of others, because, you know, it others them and says, well, you know, they've got needs, but they're not attended because they're this or they're that or they're this. So I think the English culture has ingrained in it a way of making people feel bad about themselves and sort of saying it's all okay. But no, it's not actually. Some people are better than others. George Orwell, 1984. I think that's live and always will be in the UK until class and power are addressed as narratives. And stigma in my own life, it was funny. I was emailing with Mark this week. I had a very difficult day on Wednesday, so still dealing with stigma. The poster, He Is Positive, We Love Him, that I'm in with a co-worker, Paul Hanton, and his kid Kiyoshi. The time we made that poster, I was living in a council flat in Hackney, Hugh Gate School House at the top of Stoke Newington Road, and I was the only, I'd kind of got it. Basically, Hackney let some flats that were substandard go to people in marginalised groups, and I got it based on my sexuality, and I was the only occupied flat on the top floor of a 20-storey building. All the rest were empty. Virtually every other flat that was occupied had barred windows and doors, and I was burgled 7 times. And the last time I had that poster on my wall, and the flat was graffitied with AIDS scum and a whole load of homophobic stuff. And they stole my car keys from the flat and the yellow Mini that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. And it worked for them because they took the keys and they drove it off and they dumped it 5 miles away, just, I suppose, to let me know. So yeah, and this week I kind of pushed it aside and I saw the poster and I remembered it and I cried for a whole day as I felt that pain, that stigma. So it's there and it's still there and it's still something that affects me, but I'm learning I'm going to have to heal a bit more and think about that. And it's hard to understand, I think, what the impact of that kind of thing on us is. It's extensive. I've managed to hide it and not really think about it for 20 years to the point where it can come back and seriously upset me for a day. Someone who, you know, my life's lovely. I have a lot of self-agency. I have nothing to complain about, but it's still there and it still hurts. And so it's, I don't know, just I felt the need to say that it's there and it will affect us all. And exactly like you say, I think it is still there, but I do feel that's partly British, that in the US, there's a sense of the individual. And I wonder what your experience is, Jose, in Latin America, where you go, I'm me and you can all fuck off. And it's a powerful place to be. And it has, sometimes it looks crude. there's a power with it. And that's not a great place to be in the UK. I don't feel like that's, I don't know, it's seen as arrogant within the UK, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's just rejecting other people's views and stigma.
I mean, I think it kind of happens everywhere, and it's this sense of otherness that happens everywhere, and with particularly with stigma around HIV, I think it's really interesting to think that it has changed to a certain extent, but it's pretty much there. The other thing I think about it is it's the one shared experience for almost everyone living with HIV. But that said, it's really important to sort of clarify that it's different for everyone. Like, yes, we all know how it feels. We all know what it is. We've all lived it in different ways, but those different ways make a really big difference. Yeah, I've been lucky. I wasn't kicked out from home. I wasn't rejected by ex-partners. Yes, I've had other situations, etc. But those differences and those situations that you live through your journey of living with HIV make you who you are and make your relationship with the condition completely different. So it's not surprising that still in 2021 we see people that work in the HIV sector and don't feel fully comfortable talking about their own HIV status, and that talks a lot about like what has happened in all these years. So I think, yeah, it is a shared experience, but it is different for all of us, and that talks about those sort of intersections that we all have, if we're queer, or if you're a woman, or if you're trans, or if you're for certain ethnicities. And yeah, so I think that's when it becomes more complex.
Thanks, Jose. Do you want to come back in?
Actually, the other thing that's really become very oddly obvious to me since the Black Lives Matter stuff, really, I have really started noticing in a very different way how institutionalized racism works. And do you know, all these years I've never, I've kind of brushed it away and told myself this is not happening. And now I'm massively noticing when it happens. I don't know what it is. It's that particular moment that shone a light for me on how power works in these situations. And oddly, like, virtual meetings are amazingly, they illuminate that kind of behavior in a way that it's easier for someone to dismiss you and make you believe that what's happening is not happening. But when it's in a virtual environment, it's very difficult to ignore. So it's just a funny thing that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, and I was just wanted to pick up on, there was something about when you shared that nobody asked you about your partner or where you'd been on holiday, and just that. I was thinking, it's just very painful, isn't it? It's like somebody's not saying, "Oi, you, I hate you," because of the color of your skin or because of your sexual orientation. It's like the ignoring, and I think it's still very traumatic. I think it just, like you saying, institutional racism. It's like one thing on top of another thing. It's like a whole, structure which we're all living within, and so it traumatizes us, and in different ways. It's brutal and it's traumatizing, these types of institutional stigmas in a way, and we're belittled by it. We're diminished by it, all of us, and it's sort of it really touched me when you were talking about being ignored, but also hearing Mike's story about just the violence in it, and I was thinking it's such a simple question, isn't it? I wonder about stigma and how it affects us, but how it affects us is it's traumatic. There's a body of trauma there that has happened to us all in different ways, and and that isn't an easy thing to live with. You know, it's not. Yeah, it's a legacy, and I guess what I'm thinking, what It's a Sin has thrown back at us, isn't it, is the more obvious kind of hatred. But like we say, that's not necessarily gone away. You know, it's still with us. It still lives in us, in our bodies, in our minds. So
but I was just going to say, very much like this, a part of this week was, I was remembering, you know, I lost my home. I wasn't the one in the wrong. I lost my home. But then I was just in an office, in a shared, I work in a shared office right now, and there's people there not wearing masks. And you ask them to wear masks and they don't wear masks. So I leave because I want to be safe. And I'm like, yeah, again, here I am walking away. But in that moment, I was also really upset and really angry and not really able to act with the kind of agency I would like to in front of this person not wearing a mask. I felt like I was acting out of anger and weakness. And that's partly the stigma and all that stuff that we hold. I feel it sort of, yeah, it carries on. It lives with us. And we have to keep healing, I think, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's Mark, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on those points around how we kind of hold things, and Sakti's point around people not acknowledging and recognizing your difference and engaging with that. And of course that becomes particularly problematic in relation to services, you know, when we're accessing services. And that was, you know, I think a massive factor for me, certainly in the early 80s, you know, that the only services that I would access or felt able to access as a young gay man were, you know, was a GU clinic, you know what I mean, in terms of being kind of wholly open about my health, my sexual experience, and you know, and then queer spaces. I think for me, in relation to stigma, you know, I grew up in a working class Catholic family community. I was really glad that Mike picked up on class. You know, I think it's an issue that goes under acknowledged, I think. And you know, so I was living in this kind of wholly homophobic environment. There was no positive image at all. The only images of queer people were negative and derogatory. So to have to kind of, you know, grow through that and then come through that, yes, you know, that does leave a legacy. You know, there was that very powerful testimony from one of the speakers in the film in relation to visiting a friend, and I think she might have been referring to the same friend, although it was very, very similar to an experience of mine in terms of a friend dying with AIDS alone, and other than his friends coming in, you know, and experiencing that kind of thing at the same time as being queer bashed. You know, I have false teeth. And 2 false teeth because I lost them, you know, in a Chinese takeaway when I was, there were guys in there who were attacking the Chinese family. They recognized me as looking a bit too like Jimmy Somerville, started dancing around me with a limp wrist, pulled me to the ground and kicked my teeth out. You know, those things stay with us. You know, those messages, they bury deep. And you know, and that's why we need services to be wholly engaged with, you know, all of us, our experience, what we've been through, what we carry, you know, from the past.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for sharing that really personal story as well. Just sort of horrific, really, isn't it? What you experienced, you know, just that level of violence.
As it happens, I was with some queer friends, and they managed to escape. And but the memory for me again is that contrast thing, you know, which is the, you know, being bloodied, having lost my my teeth. The police arriving quite quickly and then deciding, we don't need to hang around here, and buggering off almost immediately. But then going back to a friend's flat, and there being a whole crowd of us, very much like It's a Sin, and of that time, and just the love and warmth, and how important it was to be surrounded by other queer people, giving me. Well, actually, we were more diverse than queer. Friends who showed me that love and warmth at such a vital time. And again, you see, that's why it's so important that people have those spaces and that ability to get that support, as somewhere like the Metro provides. I think there's another issue for me that I want to flag up, which is that, I think the Metro is such a wonderful model. When we were talking around, relationships between men and women, the support that we do or don't offer each other, and all of that. I think that the Metro is such a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful example of that. It's such a wonderful story that, as somebody who hasn't been directly involved in the organisation for decades now, so I don't have any particular beef in terms of bigging it up. I just think, it kind of frustrates me that its story is not known as well as it is as a model of how queer communities can work and live effectively together.
Thank you. So I wanted to just bring in, I wanted to just spend. We've got about half an hour left, so as long as you're not flagging, we can maybe take a deep breath, and we'll have another sort of 20 or so minutes together. So I wanted to just sort of zoom forward a bit to present day, and I wondered whether you could see. I noticed myself being quite triggered by some of the messaging around the COVID-19 pandemic and the so-called health promotion around that. And well, we've been in a very, been in the middle of another pandemic, haven't we? And it's just evolving. So I just wondered whether you have any reflections on, in a way, through this time of the HIV epidemic, pandemic, and then the COVID pandemic, what the sort of similarities or differences you feel there might be, and maybe the way in which the two have impacted on the LGBT community. You get any sense, and also where it's been an incredible year around Black Lives Matters, and that seems very sort of infused in our time together, doesn't it? It's somehow we have both been doing community this year in a different way with each other, and we've been very isolated. So it's a really paradoxical time. So just wondering if you have any sort of reflections on that at this time. Sakti? Yeah.
Mike, I got in ahead of you there.
That's great. That's great.
I suppose I've spent the last 2 weeks doing a bit of a review about the impact of COVID on communities in Lewisham, and just because of our grant funding and thinking about where we need to spend money. And one of the things that just astounds me is the massive level of public health and other support around really getting to the bottom of who it's impacting on, the disproportionate impact of COVID, talking about the different communities who have been really massively disproportionately impacted by COVID. And there is a part of me that is so angry when I read that, I'm afraid, because I keep thinking back to, why did we never have this? Why did we never have this then? Why did they never say this, this is massively impacting on gay men? Come at it from the angle of, these are the people who need our help. These are the people who need the resources. Why did we have to fight for it? And nobody now has to fight for it. I say that, but interestingly, I also talk to my friends who work in international development, and they talk about sex workers who are really struggling to get tests, who will never get the vaccine, who won't see the vaccine for years. They talk about people who are substance abusers who won't get that, homeless people, people in parts of the world where that is much more right up, up and central. And it's made me really reflect on the whole thing around equality and the difference between saying that we want equality and the point at which you get it, and almost right at the beginning of that journey is being visible and making ourselves visible, which is kind of circling back to the it's a sin conversation, because actually it is about telling those stories and making it visible. But the time we get from there to having equality for all of the people who are in the margins, it's a massive, long journey. And I don't know if it'll ever be done.
Thank you, Sakti. Yeah. We've got Mark and Mike fighting to get in. Looks like Mark is suggesting you go, Mike.
I was going to say go, Mark, but yeah, I've been extremely angry throughout this from the start. I feel like lockdown was about a failure. I mean, in fact, I remember reading in January that they were keeping a bunch of people on a cruise ship because some people were infected, and they thought that was a good idea. Like, we'll quarantine this entire cruise ship, and that's the way to deal with this transmissible disease. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, yeah, well, I know that kind of makes some sort of common sense, but everything I learned is no, don't do that. You have to bring them in. You have to start treating people. You have to start testing. You have to start dealing with it. And no, just hiding people is never going to work. And I remember arguing with people, and they're like, what are you talking about? Obviously, we should just keep them on the ship. And I was digging through papers, like trying to find research from the World Health Organization that would say, no, this is bad practice. And it just felt like the entire response was wrong right from the start. In the West, I find it hard to talk about China in the East. I don't really know enough about them to know, but it was wrong and it made me angry. And then we got into lockdown, and I'm like, no, we need to start educating people about risk and transmission and exposure and move away from rules. And we should have been prepared for that, but no, we weren't. So we came out of lockdown. We didn't really have any messaging. And then we're back in lockdown, and lockdown's a real failure of any other message getting to people. And we've with COVID, we haven't given anybody else a chance to write that message. It's just coming from basically Dominic Cummings and whoever comes after him. There's no ownership beyond a tiny fraction of people in government. That's problematic. Yes, and it just, we went on the Black Lives Matter demos here, and it felt risky. We were unsure. We wore masks, but it was almost something about the isolation allowed people to see what was really happening. Those people who haven't normally seen it, who might, because police here have been killing black people for a long time. It's not new. But there was something about people's isolation and maybe their vulnerability in that isolation that allowed them to see that those officers had essentially just murdered a black man in plain view because they were scared inside of something, who knows what. And people were able to respond, I suppose. But yes, at the same time, COVID is reinforcing for me all the same people are struggling, and they're struggling more. And we have, in a sense, like you say, Sakti, we have sort of identified it in a way we never did with HIV, or we've we've realized we need to go to them and understand their stories in order to understand how to communicate and move forward. But I'm not sure it will change. And I wanted to conclude, I just think we need to talk about power as a society. That power undermines all these dynamics: class, race, misogyny, all these things are really enactment of power and power relations. And I feel like until we can really talk about power, it's going to be hard to move away. We can talk about our identities, we can talk about what we need, but we've got to talk about power, I think, as a culture. And that's my hope, that we can do that.
Thank you, Mike. And Mark?
Yeah, picking up on what Sakti and Mike were saying there. For me, I think it's very much in line, I think, with what they were saying. The you know, my great frustration has been that, you know, having said that, you know, we changed the world to a degree, you know, we're left time to reflect. We've had the opportunity to reflect and realise that how much more there is still to be done, you know, and how much how little in some ways the world has changed. And I've just been so frustrated at you know, that you know, in a world in the 80s and 90s where so much was done to us and not with us. You know, picking up on Mike's point around power, you know, that decisions were taken for us, and we could be ignored. And I think that one of the things, one of the massive lessons from that whole experience in the 80s and 90s was this recognition that that it's actually by putting people at the centre, you know what I mean, of their own story, of their own experience, of decisions in relation to resourcing and what have you, that we really make change, and we get people on board and they own the message. It becomes their message, their story. And you know, it's been so frustrating to see that top-down approach in relation to this pandemic from the outset. You know, that complete ignoring of what resources are there. And you know, and when we hear now about you know, vaccine resistance within certain, you know, Black and ethnic minority communities, it's kind of like, for God's sake, you know, we've had a year for people to be drawn in and to be resourced and to take ownership of this pandemic, and they haven't done that. So surprise, people don't feel as connected to it and as owning of it as they need to be. So yeah, I'm frustrated. I'm very, very frustrated and angry that the huge lessons and gains that we learned through the last and ongoing pandemic have been ignored in relation to this one.
Yeah, and I think it really hit home to me when I heard Priti Patel talking about kind of blaming and shaming people for their behaviour around COVID, and I just was immediately right back there in terms of the HIV epidemic, you know, and I just thought, oh no, this just doesn't work. This just makes it worse. So yeah, it's horrible, isn't it, to see people make the same mistakes? Yeah, when you know it doesn't work. So
and hard sometimes. I was going to say, and hard because you kind of go, I know that doesn't work, but how do you make people listen to you?
Yeah.
And when you say, you know, costing billions of pounds being, you know, that could be used so much more effectively in terms of bringing around, you know, change, wider societal change. You know, no wonder people are angry.
But maybe it's, you know, Mike, you talk about enactment of power. Maybe that's what societies do when pandemics happen. They immediately go to the default top-down kind of, let's talk about power. We will tell you what to do.
Yeah.
You know, there's been this whole joke always about public health, that public health has always been about middle-class white people telling the rest of the world what to do. And the rest of us going, no, we don't want to do that.
Yeah, they're worried well, telling
Yeah.
everybody else how to live their lives.
Yeah.
And Jose, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking of what you were all saying, and definitely, I think there's been a lot of like mistakes that for us working in, or for us that have worked in HIV or that work in HIV seems very familiar, like very known, and we're seeing all those mistakes. There's clearly something around like what Saki was saying about like this exposure of widened inequalities that have always been there, but that this pandemic is making clearer. And I think my other thought about it is just how triggering it's becoming for people living with HIV in general, for people who lived through the AIDS pandemic and yeah, in the 80s and the 90s, just with everything around. Yeah, what you were saying, Joe, the shaming, the blaming, the lack of clear public health messaging, the sort of, yeah, now like we're hearing about like all these punitive policies, and it's just like one after the other, like all the things that we know that don't work, and yeah, just the nature of viruses and how that can be very triggering for people, and the use of this like war-like language that governments love to use when talking about viruses, and we're just gonna defeat it, and we're gonna kill it, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, like you still don't know that you might end up living with the virus for many years. So I find that language very, very complicated, and I think it's happening a lot, and I find that's going to have a massive impact in people for many years, like the trauma. If we're still dealing with some of the trauma from the AIDS epidemic, like I think the trauma from this is going to be very, yeah, probably more complicated.
Yeah, thank you, Jose. So we've got about just over 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to maybe pose a final question. My mind always makes things very complex, so hopefully this is a simple question. So I was just thinking, last week was HIV testing week, and we had a record number of people testing for HIV, and so I was just thinking, what given that we've talked about being alongside each other and loving each other, what would your sort of thoughts be, your sort of message to somebody who's thinking of taking a test? And I'm aware I'm talking about an HIV test, but that shadow of that sort of COVID test also is in the mix, isn't it? It's like, how can we love each other better? Sort of love each other to good health, really, isn't it? What sort of what would you say to somebody who's thinking of taking a test right now? Want to start us off, Jose?
Oh, I don't know, Joe. It's a very difficult one. I think one that you're doing a great thing, but just taking the test is a great thing. That will be my first message, and then don't worry about the result, and that whatever the result is, you'll there is a way through it, I guess. Yeah, especially with people testing for HIV now, I find it very difficult because there's this idea that a positive result today is very easy to navigate, and we know it's not the case, and we know it's still a very difficult result to navigate or to deal with. So doing it in the middle of another pandemic and without being able to be within your support networks and within your loved ones, I think that's very difficult. So just yeah, I will just say, not only to the person taking the test, but to the people administering the test, that there are support networks and that there are services running and happening online, which is not the ideal way, I guess, but it is a way of supporting people, especially those who receive a sort of positive result in the case of HIV.
Thanks, Jose. And Mark?
I only realised or remembered a day or two ago that I didn't actually take my first test until the early 90s, and it was kind of like, oh my god, you know, and then remembering that history and the fact that you know, the reasoning, the thinking behind that, and actually the community advice, you know, from the community was you know, of the limited benefit that would be, but of course through time, you know, those benefits, the advantages have become more and more apparent. I think what Jose says is very important around that importance of support and who your you know, your connections and your networks, and trying to make sure that you're as connected and supported as you can be. I think, you know, I think knowledge is power in this instance, but it's about, you know, using the resources that are available to you to make sure that you're then best able to make use of the result that you've got.
Thanks, Mark.
That's tricky to know what to say. It really is. I do think, yeah, Jose, it's still a complicated thing to navigate. So people need support. They need people around them, and that must, you know, that's difficult at this time. But I do feel, my sense is it does, knowledge, it, like Mark says, knowledge is power in this case, and maybe it wasn't in the late 80s. And when we connect with agency, we make better decisions, and that's about all I can add. I feel it's a difficult decision to take, I think, but one that, when it's worked through, is useful. It's helpful to know status.
I don't know. I wonder, when we say these things about someone, when we say it's good, knowledge is power, you should take a test, whether we're prepared to walk alongside that person for the rest of the time to see what the consequences are for them. Because really, the consequences for different people are very, very different. And, you know, I'm just kind of conscious that sometimes people, my friend who works in a school, in a primary school, as their premises manager, they would never test him. It's a conscious decision, because they'd have to close down the school because if he was positive. So there are sometimes, for people, there are real reasons which are also connected to their lives, their real lives, the things they have to do, the responsibilities they have, the consequences that are so massive. And I think we just need to understand that. One of the things, though, about this pandemic, that I've really reflected on, because we were having a kind of discussion about mental health, and one of the things that's come out for me is that people are just much kinder to each other and much more forgiving, I think, or much more desperate to make a connection with other people. That's my experience. When I go out for walks, people who would never say hello to me in any ordinary time are saying hello to me. And so I think there's a kind of forgiveness in the air and a bit more love, which is also like the first pandemic, I like to think.
Yeah, nice, Sakti. Yeah, it's a really strange paradox, isn't it? That, well, in all of this loss, there is this gift. You know, there is love, and there is, you know, people say hello to each other when they wouldn't have normally, and we know our neighbours more than we ever did. So yeah, it's again, a crisis time, a time of great loss, but also there's this togetherness. And I was very moved, but listening to you all talk actually about, what, often people say, oh, what would you say to somebody who's thinking of taking a test? It's an often common thing that we'll have all heard over the years, but I feel more confident that in your answers than I've ever heard, actually. I feel the tentativeness, the thinking about the consequences, the unsure nature of it, the fear, actually. I feel like you're alongside in that decision, rather than that you're a health promoter telling me or anyone else to take a test. I feel like you live it and know it, and these are not easy choices to take or live with. So, and I wonder if because of the COVID pandemic, we all understand that just a little bit more. We're just a little bit more intimate with our own fear right now, our own vulnerability, and it makes us closer to each other. It sort of it definitely brings us alongside more. So there's just a sense of that flavour for me in what you've all said. So
thank you. And I think we can see the sort of life slow enough to see other people. Like, we live such rapid lives normally, not sure we see how people feel, even if we're trying, or that they're able to let us see it. Got to go do the next thing, got to be there, got to do this, and that the slowness, I think, has helped.
Yeah, and there's something about being on screens together, isn't there? That, well, people say that screens are less intimate, but it's a bit perverse. They're more intimate in some ways. It's like I'm so delighted that we've managed to have you here, Mike, because you live in New York, and we wouldn't normally have that. So it's sort of, what a gift. Again, this sort of paradox of feeling far away, and with some sort of barrier, but actually we reach in to each other, don't we? We affect each other, we touch each other.
Yeah.
I think important commonalities we've pinpointed there, aren't there? Those issues around isolation and being alone in both pandemics, and also that importance of connectedness. And Joe, I think you're very right. That the fact that screens enable us to maintain that connectedness and to reduce that isolation, is a wonderful thing.
I just want to share a story about my boss, who was in a meeting with a number of us, trying to tell us, be very strict about the thing that we had to do. And his 3-year-old came into the room and started telling him off about the Lego that he hadn't sorted out for him. And it was just hilarious seeing him being taken down in that way. It was amazing. So in that sense, being inside people's homes is really intimate. It's amazing. It humanizes us all in a way.
Yes.
I've been glad. Sorry, Mike. I've been glad to be muted while my dog's been scratching at the door to get in.
I was just gonna say that being in people's home might be something that is really key in health promotion, and that we've never been able to properly do. That we always try to do but don't really manage, and this is a way into it as well.
Mike, did you have a final comment you wanted to make before we wrap up?
Wow, thank you.
No pressure, Mike, no pressure.
Yeah, I just sort this out. Thank you for being able to chat. Thank you for listening. Thank you for great questions. Thank you. I am just so proud that the work we did sort of sustains. There was always a hope when we started what we were doing that we didn't need to exist very soon. And it's a shame, it's a crying shame that that's not the case. We could have eradicated HIV by now, and we haven't. And anger again, and we'll make the same failure with COVID, anger again. But I am so proud to have contributed to something that works against that. And I often feel, you know, I said we don't do anything for women. I often feel like we're so poor in a way, and we really don't improve. So when I feel like there's something I did do that was good and it seems to be, I just feel extremely proud. And thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good to hear you. So I just wanted to really thank you all. You know, I feel like I was just with a bunch of human beings tonight. We sort of started, didn't we, talking about various things, but we seem to be concluding with a sense of that connectedness and love is something that will see us all through, and needs to infuse the work that we do. And you know, you can see some of the comments coming in. I think people have really appreciated what you've all shared, and how we've been together as well, and hopefully that, you know, that sense of our history, as you know, we've all been involved in HIV and also activism, and also that sense of Metro's history and some of these values that we're all trying to live up to. You know, I feel very inspired just to be amongst you and hear from you, and I feel like there's a lot of wisdom here, and also a lot of kindness, and you can't ask for more than that. So I just want to really extend Metro's thank you to Mark Thompson, who had to leave us early, and to all of you here. It's been, yeah, really, really beautiful discussion, very insightful and inspiring, and yeah, I hope everybody out there has really enjoyed it. I'm sure they have. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Fantastic to chat to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.